Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar of the Nordic Harmonisation of Life Cycle Assessment. Today, we will hear about the decarbonisation of the Nordic building stock and setting limit values. Before we start, I just wanted to let you know that this webinar will be recorded. My name is Marja Tiainen, and I work as the Senior Specialist at the Ministry of the Environment of Finland. I am the project owner, and I am leading this project from our part. We have had several other webinars of this project, which were also recorded, and you can find those recordings and materials on the website of Nordic Sustainable Construction website. Before we start the actual content of the webinar, I will shortly say a couple of words of the whole project and who is behind it. So the Nordic Sustainable Construction is a program under the Nordic Council of Ministers, which contributes to the Nordic Vision 2030 of becoming a sustainable and integrated region by 2030 in respect to sustainable and construction and housing. And purpose of the program is to accelerate the knowledge and capacity for the green transition in the Nordic construction sector, strengthen Nordic collaboration, and also ensure an aligned Nordic path. This program is organized into the following 5 work packages, working with the specific area of sustainable construction. So we have here Nordic harmonization of life cycle assessment, circular business models and procurement, sustainable construction materials and architecture, emission-free construction sites, and program secretariat and competence for reducing construction. This project that we are about to hear from belongs to the first work package, so the Nordic harmonization of life cycle assessment. In this work package, in Nordic harmonization of life cycle assessment, we work towards harmonization normative methods for building LCAs in the Nordic countries. Similar approaches will benefit in construction industry and policymakers on national and municipal levels so that we can support each other's climate ambitions in regulation and in green public procurement, but also in the European policy development. So this work package 1 consists of 5 different subtasks. So we have Nordic LCA practices, which was completed 1 year ago. Then we have this task 2, database and scenarios, which was completed this summer. Then we have digitalization of LCA task 3, which was also or will be completed during this autumn, and the webinar of this task 3 will be held in a couple of weeks. Then we have this, so task 4, short name for it was the limiting values, and then we have task 5, acceleration program, which is currently going on and will be completed during this year. So thank you. I hope you enjoy the webinar. More information of the Nordic Sustainable Construction can be found under these links. I will give the floor to the project team. Please, Morten, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Maria. And hello, everyone joining here for this webinar. We're really pleased to present to you the outcome of this project that has been running for roughly a year. and the final report that has just been published. So it's a really nice day, and it's really nice to be able to present this. Yes, so first a short agenda for the webinar. We just had the welcome from Maria, and I will present a bit about the project and sort of the overall frame of this, and then we'll dive into the topic or the content of the report and the project, and sort of the results that we've came up with and managed to get on decarbonisation of the building stock, and then development of carbon limit values for buildings. Afterwards, there will be Q&A, so you'll have the option to write questions, comments, and then we'll try to address as many as possible of these, and then we'll end the webinar at 12. In relation to the Q&A, please please write comments, questions in the Teams chat. Then I will collect all of these, and then we'll see there will be a short time after the presentation for a few questions, comments, but not a long time. And then the last part of the webinar will be dedicated to the Q&A. So if you add your question, comments there, then I'll collect them all, and then we'll have the Q&A section or session. As you know, there's limited time for answering questions, and if you have a very complex or detailed question that probably require more elaborate answers and potentially like more discussion, then we really welcome you to send these to either the mail I added the link to, or directly to my email, and then I will forward it to the relevant person from the project team to have this discussion. Because we also know that some things cannot be answered easily in 5 or 2 or 5 minutes. That's not possible here. So not going a lot into this. Maria, you already presented that this project that we have done, it's part of a bigger set of projects where we have been looking into greenhouse gas limit values, how to define these, harmonization or differences across the Nordic countries and Estonia, and then how to monitor decarbonization of the building stock, again, across the different Nordic countries and Estonia. And here I would say we have had a quite big project team looking into this. So we had Maria and Kai and Nicola and Harper and Indrid and Rasmus from Aalborg University in the group called Build. And we had me, Morten Røberg, and Nikolaj Langkjær as core from Sweco Denmark, together with Bjørn and Christine Collin. From Sweco Sweden, we had Anna Jonsson and Inga Sjöberg. From Sweco Norway, we have had a lot of help from Karin and Isabel. And then we had from Finland, Satu and Kari. And then we had Annie Oviev from LCA support in Estonia, and Alexandra Kjell from EFLA. So this is the core project team that have been working on this, and all of the things we are presenting, this has been prepared by these persons. So a great thanks there. The project has been running for roughly 1 year and split into a number of work packages. And with the beginning being on setting and assessing limit values, we had a webinar on this in January, presenting the first results of this part, and also looking into decarbonization of the building stock. During this time, also we had this is the first part, the first work package. So there's a report related to this, where there is an in-depth analysis of different regulatory needs, the conditions, requirements for performing LCAs at a building level in the different Nordic countries, and looking into what are the similarities and what are the differences between different assessments. And again, seeing, okay, how can we potentially harmonize this. And that's also a link, and I will really welcome you also to read this report, because it's many of the things that are in this new report refer back to this one, so they are tied together there. Now we have the final project report that is out. You can find it via this link, Decarbonisation of the building stock. It provides a very good overview of what is the current decarbonisation landscape. So what are the ambitions at national level, but also looking more into the building sector or industry and seeing, okay, how ambitious are we in terms of decarbonisation? And then there is a mapping, an overview of, again, methods for assessing buildings' climate impacts, methods for assessing limit values, and also what is the landscape in terms of already setting limit values. And then there's looking into the building stock levels. So how do we assess this? What are the methods that are available there, and what are the approaches that are already used? And then looking into some of the implications of this, and which are the affected stakeholders in relation to this. And finally, of course, there's a lot of recommendations targeted different aspects related to these overviews, and saying, okay, how can we improve harmonization, or what's needed to further advance better assessments of at the building level and at the building stock level. But Nikolai and Maria from Build will go much more into details with the content of the report. And of course, having done this project, having worked on this for a year, we believe it's extremely good work, and we see that this provides a very solid or good basis for further investigating harmonization, and also seeing if there is options for harmonizing, because we also found that there are many good reasons for having differences in assessment methods and setting limit values, and this is a good basis for advancing this work. Many of the good experiences we see across the Nordic countries can also serve as inspiration for other countries. So when they have to develop methods for assessing their buildings, setting limit values, assessing decarbonisation of the building stock, this report it gives the overview of how have other countries done this, and it can serve as inspiration for this. And then we see it also as it can be a nice input for ongoing future developments in setting methods, standards for performing these tasks. For instance, at the EU level, where there is ongoing work in how to monitor the building stock, how to assess buildings, we see it as a valuable input there. Now, with that, preparing setting the overall framework of this project, I would like to give the word to my colleague Nikolai Langkjær to talk more about the monitoring decarbonisation of the building stock.
Yes, thank you, Morten. Yes, as Morten said, my name is Nikolai, and I work here at Sweco, Denmark, together with Morten. And I have been leading this part of the project. And if you read the report, this is chapter 3 in the report, which concerns about defining recommendations for how we monitor the decarbonisation or the carbon emissions from the building stock. So it's on a stock level here. So I just want to start out with zooming a little bit out, and then we zoom in again, because what we did in the beginning of the report here is that we tried to outline the carbon reduction goals for each of the countries that we're researching, so all the Nordic countries and Estonia. And what we found is that all the Nordic countries are part of this EU's national determined contributions, or at least have given commitments to follow the same goal. So if the country is not in EU, they follow EU's national determined contributions. So the Nordic, all the countries have introduced laws and regulations to mitigate climate change, and they have all set goals of becoming carbon neutral by 2050 or earlier, according to what we're also looking into at an EU level. So no surprise there, actually. But all the countries are following EU levels, and then some of them have moved the target a bit. And also in line with the European Green Deal, most of the countries have introduced a reduction target for greenhouse gases by 2030 also. This percentage value, which you see here in the blue table over here with the 2030 reduction, the percentage value of the target varies a little bit across the different countries, but all of the countries have set a target below the 50 or above the 50%, which is the EU target, or 40%. So why do we concern about this? Of course, in relation to the national decarbonization and climate neutrality goals, all sectors across all countries must contribute to this reduction of emissions. And well, we all know that the allocation of these emission reductions for each sector in each country is a very strong political decisions, and these allocations can create a lot of debate. But nonetheless, all sectors must contribute to this reduction. And to facilitate reductions in the building sector, we've seen carbon limit values has been introduced in many countries. And the limit values at the building level act as this direct mechanism to ensure that the construction of new buildings is in line with this overall effort of decarbonizing the building stock and thus also the national targets of decarbonizing. So this is, of course, why we're concerned about the national decarbonization goals also. So in order to effectively address the decarbonization of the building stock, we've found it quite essential to define what we mean when we say building stock. We say this word a lot. And in the beginning of this project, we had a lot of discussions of what we meant by building stock, because we could say that building stock could be what already exists, but we've tried to define it in a different way than just buildings that exist today. So we've been working with this definition of the development of the building stock over time. So we refer to it as the building stock dynamics. And we've looked into these key elements that defines the dynamic of the building stocks, which is, well, new buildings in use. So that's the existing stock, you could say. And then we have renovations, and of course, when we're tearing down buildings, we also have emissions related to this. So the primary focus in this report in regards to both developing methods for monitoring and also developing recommendations for the limit values, which Maria will talk much more about, has been on new buildings. We also have some recommendations for buildings in use, renovations, and demolishing or waste treatment, which I will also talk a little bit about soon. But we've gone into depth with the new buildings and the methods for new buildings. So environmental building stock modeling method can, to say in broad terms, be divided into these two models. So we have a top-down approach and we have a bottom-up approach. And what we found is that we have these national emission accounts, which are sector-based, which is basically the top-down approach. And then we have this building level emission accounts, which has the potential at least to be a bottom-up approach. The national emission account approach is quite well established, while building level emission accounts is not really established yet, at least. Yeah, so carbon accounting at the building level and the national reporting methods are two very different frameworks. Or you could say that the building level emission account doesn't really have a framework yet. There's many different approaches to this. But the national emission account is at least a very fixed framework that we're working inside. So it's a well-established, in all EU and EFTA countries through EU regulations that you have to report emission through this framework called SEA. And it's a method based on economic flows, in broad terms. I don't want to go too much into detail with defining the national emission accounts here. That's not the... Is there someone saying something? No. So these are basically in broad terms, the two building stock modeling approaches you could have. And what we see is that the national emission account provides this. We found them both very useful. National emission accounts provides this macroscopic perspective and supports policy formulation towards the national reduction targets. And we actually also found that so one of the disadvantages by looking only at national emission accounts is that we don't have this microscopic view where we can go in on building level and see potential mitigation options. But what we actually found was that Sweden, Boverket, together with, now I can't remember, but a university in Sweden has developed this method where they take the national emission accounts and actually breaks them down into something you could say more useful. It's not on a building level and it's still not a bottom-up approach, but they divide it into two categories that can refer to some of the building stock dynamics that I just mentioned. So this was very useful to look into, and we also mentioned this in the report. But monitoring at the building level is really important to understand these individual buildings' carbon footprint and identify these specific emission sources, to do a hotspot analysis, to identify mitigation options. And it's also really instrumental in informing the development of the carbon limit values, which again, Maria will talk more about, as a measure for decarbonizing the building stock. So that's why we are really looking into this method. So the national emission accounts typically takes into account like this entire range, you could say, of the building stock dynamics that I presented before. And although the entire scope is covered, it's really difficult to divide it into the desired subcategories useful for identifying optimization potentials. And the accounts at the building level must be managed in these several elements to cover the full scope. So that's the emission from new buildings, emission from buildings in use, emission from renovations, and emission from demolitions. And again, we've had the main focus on new buildings, but we also have some recommendations for how we could manage some of the other parts here. So what we did was, as national accounts method was well-established standard, and it's of course an important tool for policymaking, we didn't continue to investigate further into this, developing this method. But what is missing today is a well-established bottom-up method that can help us understand the emission mitigation opportunities on a building level scale. So we started out by asking ourselves these questions: what building-related data is already being recorded today, and could we potentially utilize this data for a bottom-up environmental building stock modeling approach? So basically, could we start out with the data that already exists? That was the question. And that's also what the main parts of chapter 3 in the report concerns about. So we started out by analyzing, our analysis by making lists of databases or other relevant information sources related to buildings or building activity for each country. And now I don't have the full table here because there wasn't really space for it, so it's larger in the report. But everything from building registers to energy certificate databases and databases with listed and protected buildings was taken into account in this list, as it could be potential descriptors for buildings in these countries. We then mapped out the databases by categorizing data which was inside the databases into these key elements that we found could be useful for either describing the building characteristics or a potential environmental impact. So that could be something about what materials is being used, what kind of embodied carbon emission is linked to these materials, or it could be what is the operation of these buildings, so water, electricity, heating, and so on. And we also did a mapping of whether any of the countries had carbon declarations yet inside any databases. So what we found from this analysis was that, very good data. There was a very good data availability and accessibility for both building characteristics and operations. But we also found that we have very limited data on materials in the building characteristic data across all countries. And we found that there was really no, both within the countries, so both national or cross-border coherence on either platforms, data formats, reporting schemes, and so on. And that made it very challenging to, for example, cross-reference data between databases. So if you wanted to use some data from, say, the protected and listed buildings, because there was something about materials, we couldn't really connect it with a building register database we could see, because there is no really talking together between the databases. So that was a very big limitation in terms of using the data. So we found that it was actually only really Sweden that was officially recording, gathering, storing, analyzing the data from climate declarations now, which, could be used as a direct use for new buildings at least. We also found actually in the end of the project here, and that is also in the report, that Iceland also have an official reporting scheme now, which is an online scheme, and I will come back to that. But basically, we found that it was very complex, to piece together data from different databases and information sources, because of there wasn't any coherence in platforms or data formats and so on. And the general limitation of the existing database or data landscape there is the inability to directly facilitate the monitoring of environmental impact from buildings. So we cannot really use anything direct except for actually these climate declaration database in Sweden, which we found very useful. So so our recommendation was that carbon emissions related to building stock on a stock level should be monitored in this two-level system, you could say. We should not phase out the national accounts. It's already well established, and we go further into this in the report. I don't really have much of this information in this presentation, but this Swedish method of sophisticating the national accounts is really useful, and we dive into that in the report. But the other, you could say, level in this two-level monitoring system is this bottom-up building level approach. And we've done some, we have these 4 recommendations for new buildings, buildings in use, renovations, and demolitions. That for new buildings, we need to establish a system, and we really recommend all countries to establish a data gathering system so we could start analyzing this data from the carbon declarations. And for buildings in use, we found that for a cost-effective and harmonized approach, we could utilize the operational energy use data that is being reported to the EU Building Stock Observatory. So it's already there. That's why we recommend it. Of course, we need to work with some emission factors because right now it's energy use it's per building type in this EU Building Stock Observatory database. But if we use good emission factors and add it to these energy data, then we could get some emission data. For renovations, we also recommend to introduce climate declarations for renovations to monitor the environmental impact here. And demolitions, we recommend that data collections on the amount of construction waste divided into fractions could be utilized with emission factors, of course, for waste management of these different fractions. We see that the quality for construction waste data is not the best today, so we also recommend to work more on getting better data from construction waste if this approach should be utilized. So that's the recommendations for these dynamics in the building stock, and I will go a little bit more into the new buildings. Because in order to effectively monitor and manage the decarbonization efforts at the building level, it's of course necessary to aggregate the emission accounts. So the aggregation will provide this macro level of overview of the footprint. And we found that there were two main methods for aggregating the data. There is the archetype method, and then there is this sampling method. So the archetype-based modeling involves representing multiple buildings with a smaller number of representative archetypes. Buildings are then clustered based on common characteristics such as type, year of construction, size, and so on. And these archetypes are then used to model the environmental impact of the entire building mass. It's kind of this approach that has been used in at least some of the countries to develop some of the limit values. For example, we have a sample of the total building mass, and then we develop some limit values per building type. And that was also what we thought about we could maybe have done with the existing data landscape if it had been better. We could potentially have recommended to develop some carbon goals for each archetype, and then we could have put some numbers on with the size and type. The other method is the sampling method, which involves the collection and analysis of data from all individual buildings. And this method focuses on assessing environmental impacts on building by building by using, for example, carbon declarations, or it could also, if it was energy, it could be energy performance certificates, for example. And this, of course, requires a very structured data reporting format and a robust system for handling the data. But nonetheless, this is really our strongest recommendation here, that since the carbon declarations soon will be mandatory for all EU member states, at least, Maria will tell a little bit more about this, I know, in a minute, but this is part of the EPBD. We then recommend all the countries to a system that is able to handle these this very useful data that is being reported. The data could be used to create these yearly overviews of emissions from new buildings, for example. So this is a very strong recommendation to take out from the project and the report that we really recommend to follow up on this very useful data that is being reported now. And we also actually see this happening in some countries now. That so for this harmonized Nordic approach, which was also part of the project to recommend a harmonized approach across borders, we recommend for the countries to look into, I mean, both the Iceland and the Swedish method for collecting and publishing data. And I've just taken a screenshot here from Iceland's. They have this online submission portal, which makes it very easy for the users, the building owners that have to report the data. And it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's not mandatory yet, but it will be to use this reporting format, which is, in our opinion, a very good way to make building owners do it actually. And then I have this example from the Swedish Boverket site, where they actually publicly disclose the data. So we actually have this macro level overview of the emissions from the carbon declarations that has been reported. So these are divided into building types. And just to round off here, we also see many different private and public initiatives to gather and present emission data from carbon declarations emerging. We have this in Denmark. We have this Knowledge Center for Climate Impacts of Buildings, which are building up this case library. We have ourselves in Sweco, Denmark. We have this database with over 200 LTAs on over 270 projects now. And we also see that our good colleagues in Rambøll recently released a database. So there is a lot of databases on LCA and carbon declarations emerging, both private initiatives and public initiatives. And just a little teaser, I know Morten will talk a little bit more about this in the end, but as part of this Nordic Sustainable Construction Program, and Maria T also talked about these 5 tasks. Task 5 is now running, and we are also a part of that. And here we are actually also developing this. It's called Best Case Catalog, but it will also be this. It will be this, as far as I'm aware, this online interactive case representation. So there is a lot of emerging on this databases, but we are really recommending for also on a national level to start building systems that can handle carbon declarations, because it's really, really good and useful data. Yes, that was it from me. So Maria?
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Nikolai. Maybe that's just one question.
Yeah.
I know this is not like the main aspect you have looked into, but there's a question on how much CO2 is embedded in the building stock. So I don't know if you have like how much is new construction, how much is energy use, how much is demolition, if there's data on this.
We haven't. I don't really have the numbers right now in my head, but of course, buildings. I mean, the energy in use for buildings is the largest, I would say, as it is now. But I mean, I don't have the numbers on it, and we haven't really gone into numbers in this report. It's more a recommendation on methods for how we could measure it. So yeah. But of course, energy use for buildings is quite large. I mean, we're looking into a greener future, you could say, with a better energy performance for buildings, because we have greener energy. And that's also what we see from new buildings today. I mean, you could say that. I mean, roughly 80% now comes from materials, and 20% comes from the energy use when you look at an LCA over 50 years. Yeah. So that is the landscape right now. And that's also why we're concerning a lot about new buildings and carbon limit values, because materials is the big emitter now.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. Then we have another question, which is I think also a very good link to maybe what Maria you will be talking about shortly. But it's about dealing with data, or maybe lack of consistent data in the scope of building elements, and how to take that account. I guess it's about sort of across maybe different countries, and how do you structure and set up the LCA or assessment with regards to building elements. And I believe this is something that Maria, you have also looked into as part of this project. So maybe there will be an answer. Otherwise, we'll pick it up in the.
You could say the recommendations that we've done here in the part that I've talked about is really relying on the backbone of what Maria will talk about. Because if we want to, measure the countries up against each other, we need to have a harmonized approach for LCA.
Yeah.
Because of course it's good with a harmonized monitoring system, but if we don't have a harmonized approach of, scopes and all that, then we can't really do the measuring. So yeah. So it's on the backbone of everything else in the report, you could say. It's tied together.
Exactly. So with that, we give the floor to Maria Baluzzi from Build Aalborg University to talk about development of carbon limit values.
Thank you, Morten. Perhaps what I could add to the question before is that in this project we have seen the differences in the building component structure the countries have, the Nordic countries, but we haven't done this comparison because this was done as part of Task 2 report. So there is a mapping of how the different structures compare to each other. And I don't know, maybe perhaps Helle could also provide a link to this report in the chat. So I would now share my slides. So you can see my slides, I think, yes, yeah. So in this part of the webinar, we will talk more about how the Nordic countries have developed their limit values or are planning to develop their limit values. And we will also talk about some of the implications connected to progressively tightening the limit values. And this, let's say, part of the presentation is connected to chapter 4 and 5 in the report. So, of course, our regulations in the Nordics are not developing in isolation, and it is always important to consider, let's say, the key upcoming and ongoing regulatory initiatives in Europe that will affect the national the national carbon limits, like the revised EPBD, the construction products regulations, and others, as well as, let's say, method-related standards and the levels. I will not go deeply into the different European activities, but it's worth looking a little bit at the timeline outlined in the revised EPBD, which was published a few months ago. So in EPBD, there is a progressive, as you can see, integration of whole life carbon requirements based on a harmonized methodology, and some first aspects of this harmonized method have been already defined in this revised EPBD document. According to this timeline, more detailed elements of this methodology are expected to be set out in the so-called Union framework to be adopted by the end of the next year through a delegated act. And of course, this could impact the way we calculate total carbon emissions in the Nordic countries and Estonia. So following the delegated act, member states must publish a roadmap by January 2027, detailing, let's say, the introduction of life cycle-based carbon limits and target values for all new buildings starting in 2030. The Commission will provide some guidance that to support this process. 1 year later, member states must ensure that the life cycle global warming potential is calculated and disclosed in the energy performance certificates, first for large buildings and then for all buildings from 2030. So how the Nordics compare to this overall timeline? So as you can see here, we have Norway and Sweden were the first in the Nordics to demand to declare the climate impacts of buildings. And as the regulatory steps develop, mandatory declarations with or without limit values will be enforced in all 6 countries by 2026, the latest. So all Nordic countries, we have, let's say, at least 2 years of experience before declarations being mandated on the European level. With respect to the limit values, Denmark was the first country to introduce a carbon budget of how much new buildings must emit, which was based on a decision that 1 to 10 buildings must perform better. And these requirements now have been recently updated and be valid from next summer, like from 2025. And now the base will be for the limits that 85% of buildings must be constructed in a better way. So as you can see, many of the other countries will also follow and will gain experience with working with limit values until it is required from the EU side. So of course, behind every, let's say, limit value number, you always need to know what is included and what is excluded and what is the method behind. But also another aspect that matters a lot when setting limit values is what building types are covered by these limit values. Also, it is important when you start with a limited scope of affected projects that there is always some plan to expand the scope to more types of new building projects as the experience increases. And you can see here what are the plans in the different Nordic countries. I can give you the example of Denmark, since we already have limit values. And we started with, let's say, a limited scope, focusing on new buildings, large new buildings above 1,000 square meter. And now in the limit values to be valid from next summer, we include also single family homes and even summer houses. So you can see here how we have kind of adapted our scope as we are gaining more and more experience. So I will not go into the details here, just to show you a little bit what we covered in the report and the comparisons we did of the Nordic countries. We also, of course, compared the methodological choices behind the Nordic regulatory methods. So you can see here this big table with lots of details about how the Nordic methods compare. I do not expect you to read all these details, but I just wanted to bring this to you, just to show what we are discussing in the Nordics in relation to where do we differ, where we could perhaps align on, or what elements, methodological elements are important when making life cycle assessments. So for example, just to give you some, let's say, notable differences, at the moment we use different definitions of building reference area. Some countries are using the heated floor area, other countries are using the gross floor area. Even between the countries who are using, for example, the gross floor area, there are small differences. We differ in the life cycle scopes. Some countries cover relevant modules from all life cycle stages. Other countries like Sweden focus only on the upfront carbon, at least as a first step. We also differ in the global warming potential indicators we use and the inclusion of biogenic carbon, as well as we differ in the building parts included in the declarations and the limit values. Especially the last one, the building parts included, is quite important and gets more and more important as we tighten the limit values. As you can imagine, some parts of the buildings, like foundations, are more difficult to decarbonize. So it's really important to consider all these aspects when, let's say, defining the scope of the limit values. Of course, the reason we are discussing so much what we could harmonize and at what level is because all these method incompatibilities have the potential to create, let's say, some sort of ineffective competition for the best mitigation actions across borders. So we also explored more aspects, and I will not go into the details here. So this is like the continuation of the previous table. Perhaps it's important to mention here the last aspect, which is the templates to use when reporting the LCA results, and also Nikolai touched upon that before. So the digital reporting templates is a very important tool and instrument to let's say, collect data in one place in an easy way and follow, let's say, the effects of the decarbonization. And also what we could say here is that if we cannot align parts of our methods or elements of our methods in the short run, perhaps we could harmonize our templates, like the level of disaggregation of the different types of information these templates are requested. So we also looked at some important aspects related to scenarios and data. For instance, many of the Nordic countries have spent a lot of time for updating their energy supply impact factors and incorporated national decarbonization scenarios in these factors. And this is a very important element in the limit value itself, as future processes and modules then decrease in importance compared to the upfront carbon. However, at the moment, these such decarbonization scenarios only form part of the operational part of the life cycle, so module B6, at least at the moment, and whenever B6 is included in a method, and no such scenarios have been considered for the other B and C modules for the time being. Regarding the data, since EPDs aren't mandatory yet to produce for the manufacturers, all Nordic countries provide some sort of generic emission factors for products to support the LCA calculations when specific values for products are not in place. And these generic data have been created in different ways, using, for example, somewhat different add-on factors to make them more conservative. Furthermore, many countries, Nordic countries, are also providing standard values for components like building services, and such standard values serve as an important complementary element to support the calculations until the industry has templates available. And you can see that most Nordic countries have invested in providing such values. So I have quickly showed you how we mapped the differences in the methods of the countries, but another task and another question we wanted to address is actually which of these differences are important and which variables potentially have, let's say, the highest influence on the limit values. So for example, we looked into previous studies in the Nordics to understand, let's say, the parts of the inventory scope that differ in the methods, and see which inclusions and exclusions of certain elements can be a source of large variability in the final results. And this is the case, for example, for deep foundations, external works, building services, refrigerants, etc. We also found that differences in definitions of reference area have an influence on whether, for example, basements and balconies are seen as an advantage. But for buildings with very low emissions, basements and balconies can be harmful regardless of the reference area unit one chooses, whether it is heated floor area or gross floor area. Of course, the choice of scenarios in modules B and C has a great influence on the results. And what is important here to mention is that although we don't apply decarbonization scenarios in B and C modules other than B6, like operational energy related module, we are discussing this to apply such scenarios also for all the scenario-based modules. But it's important to be aware that these types of scenarios can only be applied to the global warming potential fossil part of the indicator, so that do not break the -1+1 balance of the biogenic carbon. So you can see that for a country, let's say, having the GVP total indicator, this kind of process will add some level of complexity in a method. Also, the differences between generic emission factors in national databases can be significant. So, for example, this can lead to differences of around 25% for a given building and over 70% for specific materials. These differences can be actually attributed to actual differences between the products found in its national market, but also there are methodological differences that lead to this level of variability. Finally, we need to have a basis to create the limit values, and this basis can be constituted of archetypes or representative real buildings. And here, what matters a lot is how this, let's say, sample is composed, because you can imagine that in most of the countries, the way we set limit values is based on some statistical analysis where, for example, in Denmark, we say, so the limit value should be set in a way that X% of buildings in a sample would not meet this value. So then this level, this limit value level, can change based on how the sample is composed. I will just give you here a couple of examples of some illustrations we have in the report. So I talked about the influence of the inclusions and exclusions of the inventory scope. Here I'm just focusing on the location-sensitive factors, because it's a very important question whether carbon limits should actually influence the choice of location. And you can see here that some of these, let's say, location-sensitive aspects like the foundations, basement parkings, external works, construction site, have a great variability. The different Nordic countries have found different ways to deal with these aspects. So in some cases, such factors are excluded from the assessment scope. Other times, for example, in Denmark, in the new limit values, we will address A5 in a separate way, so with a separate limit value. And in other cases, exemptions are allowed for extreme cases. Another illustrative calculation you can see here. So what you see here is, for example, what happens if we reduce, let's say, if we use the same building and the same reference unit and compare different, we kind of reduce the comparison to the same scope just to identify what are the variations coming from the data. So we use the Swedish, Finnish, and Danish data. We focused on just A1 to A3 and the same building model. And you can see here, for example, that there are still great differences and variations coming from the data. And how we could address it is we could, let's say, harmonize the structures of the databases and the way we apply conservative factors to the generic data, but also it could make sense to also, let's say, have a joint effort to create some, let's say, shareable generic database data for low volume construction products. Sorry, so we also, so some mitigation can, so we also looked at the further implications of tightening the limit values. So the unintended consequences in a way, some main messages here are that some mitigation can be achieved through supply chain decarbonization and careful selection of products without significantly changing the building design. But if limits are tightened significantly and or supply chain decarbonization does not, let's say, meet expectations, building design may be limited. So we will perhaps need to change the way we build and use more structural timber, use less brick, and possibly avoiding basements and balconies. Another point is that limit values can increase the demand for wood. So we should always look at the consequences carefully in relation to the forest carbon storage, the biodiversity, and the limited availability of biological resources. And this is also strongly linked to the policies in forestry and other sectors. The third point is that thresholds can actually increase costs in development projects. So there will be additional costs for unconventional design and product selection. And the higher costs will arise when the demand to decarbonize the building stock is greater than the developing decarbonization in the supply chain. So there are, let's say, studies that show that this kind of increase in the cost is in the magnitude of 1 to 5%, for instance. And last but not least, it's important to also, let's say, introduce sufficiency-based goals to build fewer buildings, build smaller or with different quality standards, as this is a decisive point for achieving ambitious climate goals. Relative carbon limits cannot address, let's say, the current demand side patterns. So these are some messages, and here I will show you an example of this part of the report. So you can see here that we have investigated some significant design variations for an archetypal apartment building calculated with Danish generic data. And we have concluded that certain limit values can have an impact on the way we build. So I will not dive deeper here. This is just an illustration. So the main message here is that if we want to develop a roadmap, we need to look into implications based on best practice today. So I will close this, let's say, my part with, let's say, some recommendations, some steps that could support the different policymakers and the countries now embarking on a journey to develop roadmaps, limit value roadmaps. So it's more or less 8 key steps to consider. So it's the first step is that, of course, it's very important to building competence of the competence of the different stakeholders, the authorities, the industry, etc. And this can be, let's say, supported by providing free learning materials. And this is what is done in several of the Nordic countries. And also it is about such learning materials are also about to be available in Europe, which will be needed to be adapted to national context. Of course, certification schemes also provide a certain level of preparedness for the industry and foster competition. It's key to secure stakeholder involvement so that to understand how to balance, let's say, the current readiness level of the industry, both with current requirements and how these requirements will develop in future. And this also creates a more long-lasting and secure implementation of the regulation. And you can see here also an overview of different partnership initiatives happening in the Nordics. You need to ensure that the stakeholders have access to generic data and standard values. This is a precondition to run the calculations since EPDs are not mandatory yet. Of course, important aspects to consider here is that all these generic values include some conservativity factor, and this should be gradually phased out so that one is able to, let's say, monitor the real performance of the building stock. It's also what is also needed is also to, if a country provides standard values, to also define, let's say, how the standard values can be used in declarations and until when it will be allowed to use such standard values in as-built declarations. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, it's also worth looking into opportunities in aligning, let's say, the structure of the generic data we provide in the different Nordic countries. Of course, we need to invest in improving the availability and digitalization of EPDs, and such this could be supported by providing subsidies or automated tools designed to generate EPDs, and this is quite useful for small enterprises. So it's important to have a basis of building data to develop the limit values. This basis can be generated through real cases, or it could be comprised of archetypes. Another thing to pay attention to is that through this statistical analysis of these cases, it's important to see whether it makes sense to differentiate the limit values, as it's easier for some buildings to decrease their emissions than others. And I have here some reports of how at least Denmark has, let's say, developed the updated limit values, and also how the basis of the Swedish proposal of the future limit values. So, of course, it's important to define your method, but starting, let's say, from a limited scope and a more manageable method keeps the implementation rolling. And then a country can have plans on how to expand on the scope, the building model scope, the life cycle scope, the types of affected projects, etc. And something that we also discuss a lot in the Nordics is the need to highlight upfront carbon reduction. So this is also an ongoing discussion whether we should actually apply decarbonization scenarios for all scenario-based modules, or whether we should have, like, say, 2 limit values, one for the upfront carbon and one for the full life cycle, etc. So this is also an issue to consider when, let's say, developing the structure of the limit values. Of course, it's very important for the industry to let's say, publish and establish a suggested limit value pathway, because the industry can prepare And the implementation of the methods and limit value levels should be incremental across a long-term roadmap. And the changes, the milestones in this roadmap should be supported always by impact assessments. Finally, I can say that most of the Nordic countries do not regulate renovations yet, but it's important to consider this for the future. Of course, there are concerns that burdens may be created for renovations with environmental benefits, and this could hinder, let's say, renovations. But I think it's also not having any regulation for renovations also hinders, let's say, innovation in this aspect. And since we don't have defined methods yet in the Nordics, this is also a kind of a possibility to start developing a harmonized approach on how to include renovations in the regulation. So thank you. So I will pass the floor back to Morten. Morten, you are muted.
Sorry.
Thank you, Maria. That's a very good point. It makes it easier. I just said, thanks for a good presentation. And there are a few questions for, I think, mainly for your presentation, but maybe Nikolai, that could also be something for you. But there's a good question about the modules included in the building LCA and sort of this, the feasibility of including all the modules, from A to C, perhaps also D, or whether it's more relevant perhaps just to focus on the ones that we know have the biggest impact. So A1 to A3 and then B6. If you have considered this. Maria, now you're muted.
Yes, I was muted now. So yeah, so from my point of view, we should have the upfront carbon like A1 to A5 in the minimum scope, and then focus on the most relevant modules for the rest of the building life cycle at the beginning, because it's wise to start have, let's say, a scope that can work first, and then in the meantime, let's say, develop also the related data for the other modules, because there is also a lack of data for modules other than like, I don't know, for C1, C2, or like B2 and maintenance and so on. So it's good to understand, and it's also something else, it could be different for every country. So for example, B6 kind of decreases in relevance for the Nordic countries, but it could be significant for other countries, other European countries. So I think each country should kind of identify which modules are relevant for their context, and then start exploring more how to expand and how to invest in creating the data needed to expand the life cycle scope.
Yeah, no, good point. Yeah, exactly. So again, this is the starting point, but certainly there's need for more tailored or specific assessments to evaluate this. Then I think there are two questions that I would say they are related, but one is about if you have any information about when EPDs will become mandatory. That's the first one. And then one is whether you see Could there be potential benefits or maybe also drawbacks from having a generic material inventories, so like a generic list of material including carbon intensity data, also for other EU countries, that like Denmark has a list of a generic material database with emission factors, but would it make sense to have one like cross-cutting the EU, for instance?
I think for some building, so I think I will start from the last question. So for some building products, some building products are cross-country, so they cross borders. So I think it would make sense to have a European database of generic values. And if not European, at least we could create one for the Nordics, because we have a lot of cross-border imports, exports, and movements and trade and so on. For more bulk products like concrete, these are mostly sourced nationally. So it could make sense to have our own national data, generic data in a way. Of course, there are flaws in using generic emissions data, but it's something unavoidable because we cannot, let's say, enforce the use of EPDs because they are not mandatory. So to support the carbon declarations and the calculation, we need to provide generic data. And I don't remember what was your first question.
Yeah, it was about when EPDs will become mandatory.
I don't have the exact timeline in my mind, but I think I believe that it will become gradually for different product categories. But I'm not sure at the moment, so I may say something wrong. So yeah, I don't know if anyone else knows or has some.
Yeah, I also don't have the answer. I mean, I think you're right that at least I know that the requirements for having LCAs on EPD is being introduced for different product categories at different points in time. It's like I think batteries is 2026. That's one thing, but we see it. So probably it's a development, but it's not set in stone. That's what I hear also. Good. Then that's a very relevant question. Certainly, what's the most important and best benefit when it comes to setting limit values? So perhaps why set limit values? Maybe that's.
Sorry, what are the benefits of having limit values in place? Or yeah, I think I mean this. If you don't have limit values, I think the sector sometimes the sector is self-motivated to reduce emissions. Also, for example, within the context of certifications and to be front runners, but to do this in a broader scale, you need to have limit values in place. So it is a very important instrument to kind of, let's say, put the sector into this process as a whole, and also thinking of ways on how to do it, and also becoming more competitive and developing more innovative solutions. Of course, this is not done when the limit value is very high, but this is becoming more and more evident as the limit value tightens, because the industry will need to come out with more innovative solutions to be able to comply with the limit values, low limit values.
We'll say if you take it up in the helicopter, it's basically the title of this project. It's to decarbonize the building stock, basically. And what we've done for many years is that we've had regulations on energy performance, and now we shift the paradigm to look at carbon emissions. So that's so it's to support the decarbonization and the national decarbonization goals.
Perfect. Great. Thanks, Maria. Thank you, Nikolai. Also, I don't really see any more questions in the chat. Anyone else has a question or comment, and maybe you can just unmute and then present the question. That's also fine. We have a few minutes left for this also. Helle, yes.
Yes. Thank you very much for the good presentations. So my name is Helle Ritter Momsen, and I'm part of this big Nordic collaboration on sustainable construction. And I know some of you know already, but maybe not all, that we will be having what we call a Nordic Climate Forum for construction next week. It's already on Wednesday. And I know that part of the program is that Philip Mosley from DG GROW in the EU Commission will be presenting. Maybe there was an EPD question and other questions that could be, maybe he can answer them there. And also, if you want more in-depth updates on the status of the Nordic countries' regulation and also their lessons learned so far, you can also get them next week. And I can send a link in the chat where you can see where to sign up and follow online. There is definitely room. But thank you very much for the great presentations and the very good questions.
Thank you, Helle. Very good point. Very good point. Then, if there are no other questions, let me see. Sorry. No. Then, if you can go on. Yeah, exactly. Yes, then just to finish off or round up the webinar, again, I just want to raise that there are these two reports. So this webinar has been about the report on the decarbonization of the building stock, where there is the link, and there's also the first report as part of this project on harmonized carbon limit values for building in Nordic countries. So I really welcome you to of course, read these, look into them, and also, if you have comments or questions to any of the reports, please feel free to let us know, because we are, of course, very interested also in getting feedback and also comments to the reports. If there is something that you simply disagree with, for instance, then we're really interested in that. So, yeah, next slide. Then, Nikolai, you already mentioned this, but I just wanted to now at the end of this webinar say that there is a new project running right now and in the fall. Maria also mentioned the Task 5, the new acceleration program, where this project team actually is running a number of clinics, low carbon clinics, to see what are the barriers and what are the challenges that the different projects they struggle with when it comes to decarbonization of their buildings, new buildings in particular. And we're trying to sort of help with this, but also collect their experience and provide this and make a report saying, okay, these are the barriers and these are the ways that these can be overcome, for instance. So again, providing more information for those of you that are working with projects and would like to decarbonize your building project. And then there is the best case catalog, where we are collecting finalized projects, the best ones, and as a way to highlight all the good progress we are making with low carbon construction, all the good experiences, basically to serve as inspiration for other new construction projects. So again, we can accelerate decarbonization. And as I said, this project is running now until the end of 24, and results will be published in report form, but also as webinar in November, December 24, and then plan to have this in mid-January. So there will be new content, new reports, and new webinars for you and those that are interested. That's all. You can go to next. that's all we have for this webinar. So thanks a lot for joining.